Hey everyone, welcome back. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Lakehouse, which is one of the most important concepts basically in Microsoft Fabric. So we should go through it in some detail. What I'm going to be doing is I've got the iPad here. I'm going to be going through some of the core concepts that we need to understand first. Then we're going to jump in, get hands-on with the tool. So I'm going to be going inside Microsoft Fabric. We're going to build a Lakehouse. We're going to do some common operations that you'll do in a Lakehouse. And throughout this journey, we'll learn, okay, what can we use a Lakehouse for? And I'll probably mention as well what the difference is between a Lakehouse and data warehouse and all these other good things that we have in Fabric. So let's get started. So here we are on the iPad. So to kick us off, the Lakehouse, where does that sit within all of the other things that we talked about in Microsoft Fabric? And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and go back to some of the old videos because we've already done quite a few videos about some of the other experiences within Microsoft Fabric. But let's just start by getting this all framed out, just so we know that where Microsoft Fabric sits really within the whole context. So this is our tenant here. And obviously we know we have one tenant, one Fabric tenant per organization normally. And inside this tenant, we know that we kind of have a foundation in Fabric, like a bedrock, which is OneLake. So this is where all of our data is stored. And it's kind of like the foundation. And again, I'll link to a video where we described in detail what OneLake is and the power of it really, why it's so awesome. So this is our kind of like base storage layer. Then on top of that, what I would do is draw 2 or 3 different kind of storage abstractions, I would call it. So we've got the data warehouse. And this is where we're going to be able to transactional database. And we can write T-SQL and all that good stuff. This is going to be our Lakehouse area. And this will become more obvious when I kind of walk through all of the different aspects of this diagram. We'll kind of build it up from the ground up. So these are what I would call our storage layers. Kind of including OneLake in that as well, because our warehouse and our Lakehouse is kind of an abstraction on top of OneLake. Everything sits in OneLake, but we just have different ways of viewing the data. So what I would do is then draw some kind of vertical lines down here. And if I just move this up, this is going to be our, and on the vertical axis, I've got different database different experiences. So in Fabric, as you know, we have different experiences kind of aligned to different roles that you get on a data project. The database developer experience, and they're obviously going to be using the data warehouse. And what I'm also going to add in here is a row for like tools. So we have our storage layer, and then you could call it compute or tools that you can use to kind of work with data in here. So that's going to be our T-SQL queries, stored procedures, all that good stuff for structured data. But then we have this Lakehouse. So if our data warehouse has structured data and we're going to be writing SQL to interact with it, what's this Lakehouse thing? Well, this is going to be used by 2 experiences, and that is the data engineering and also the data science. So what do we know about these 2 roles or these 2 fields within, the data world? Well, we know that data engineers can be responsible for managing very large data sets. So it could be gigabytes, but it could be terabytes or petabytes. So our Lakehouse needs to be something that scales up to these really big data sizes of data. We also know that data engineers and data scientists don't always work with tabular data. Sometimes you might want to run a machine learning model on some images, or perhaps some text, or even voice. This is kind of the art of data science. We don't always have structured data. In fact, we normally try and find the structure within unstructured data sets. So we need an area that can deal with both unstructured and structured data. So that's where our Lakehouse comes in. So we have kind of two separate areas here. One is for files and one is for tables. And the role of our Lakehouse, really, one of its roles is to provide a place to store files. And by files, really I'm talking about things like, normally you have like CSV or JSON or Parquet, but it could really be anything. These are kind of some common file formats that we have in data engineering world and the data science world. Then the role of the Lakehouse is to provide kind of like an on-ramp to get these into more structured formats. So you might do some loading of CSVs, cleaning it, and putting it into a Lakehouse table. So eventually it's going to be a table, but it's coming in an unstructured format. And these unstructured formats, it could be from an API. So what I haven't mentioned on this diagram is how we get data in. So we can add that in. Here I would put a few different boxes here. And this is for getting data in. I put it into one lake, but it's actually going into one lake and then into our file area. And these three boxes, again, we've got different methods for getting data into our one lake. We've gone through those in quite a lot of detail. And this is the data factory box. So that is divided up into pipelines and the data flow. And in here, these two boxes here, I'm going to put ADLS, which is Azure Data Lake Storage, and also Amazon S3. Can't even spell S3. That's good. And we can bring these in via what's known as a shortcut. These two on the right. So this data doesn't actually live in Fabric, but we can use shortcuts and bring those into our Lakehouse. And this is just a more conventional way. The data factory has two different methods, and that can get our data into here as well. And this could be data from, like I say, an external API, for example. And again, we've done videos looking at that as well, using the web activity. Okay, so the one that I haven't mentioned and is not really the focus of this video is real-time analytics. But there is a bit of a crossover here between real-time analytics and the Lakehouse, because although we haven't touched on KQL much on this channel yet, I'm kind of slowly getting to it. But the Lakehouse and KQL database can be used kind of in tandem, because KQL is going to be where you're going to be streaming data into using event streams, but you might want to store on a more long-term basis those flat files potentially of that data for kind of long-term colder storage. So that's kind of, there is a bit of a link there in terms of real-time data and the use of the Lakehouse. So we have a Lakehouse in files and tables, and we'll see what this looks like again later. But when we talk about tools then, so for the data engineer in this space, we have what's known as notebooks, and that's the same actually for data scientists. So if you're a data scientist, you're probably very familiar with notebooks. Used to be called like IPython notebooks, then Jupyter notebooks, and we have Fabric notebooks. So it gives you the notebook experience where you can write code in different cells, and we link to our Lakehouse. So if you wanted to convert data from a file to a table, then we would do that with some notebook code. The other thing to mention is a Spark job is another tool that we have. So what I haven't really mentioned yet is the Lakehouse. We've talked a lot about engines on this channel, and the engine for the data warehouse is the T-SQL, the Polaris engine, but it's the SQL engine. The Lakehouse has the Spark engine, so it's kind of built for distributed large-scale computing and number crunching, and that is Spark. So we can also use Spark jobs to schedule binary files, little bits of computation or big bits of computation, but defined in a Python file or even a jar file. So if you're using Scala or Java, then you can wrap up these bits of logic in a Python file and you can set it to run on a schedule. And that's kind of like the Spark native way of scheduling specific runs of code. So that's something to bear in mind. We can also do that there. For the data scientist, in the Lakehouse, we have models. Again, everything's on top of the Lakehouse, and experiments as well. And we'll be going into all that good stuff very shortly on the channel. But that just gives you a bit of an overview about where the Lakehouse sits within the wider Fabric context. So the Lakehouse is a concatenation of two words, which I'm sure you might be aware of, but we have on the left is lake. So it's kind of like a mixture between a data lake and a warehouse. Right. So a data lake is where we have unstructured data. So if you've used ADLS, Azure Data Lake, then it's unstructured data. We don't really have concepts of tables apart from delta tables, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the warehouse is more structured. So the Lakehouse is kind of like the best of both worlds, or at least it gives us the option to do both. And normally in an engineering project or data engineering project, if along this y-axis we have time, then at the beginning of a kind of a data pipeline, your data comes in very unstructured, and then the role of the data engineer and the data engineering pipeline is to go from unstructured to structured, normally through a notebook or even through data flow or data pipeline. That's kind of like the role that we're trying to achieve here. And if we bring that into a Lakehouse terminology or context, then we have files, is what it's called, and tables. So our role really is to get data into files, write notebooks. This is as a data engineer, this is kind of like your core job. And then write that into tables. And the tables can then be used by Power BI, but also data science, AN other, whoever you want in your organization. Absolutely lovely. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview about some of the core concepts that we have to understand with the Lakehouse. I think it's good now's a good time to head over to the tool and put some of that into action. Okay, so here we are in the Fabric homepage. This is what it looks like when you log in. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the Lakehouse. So I'm just clicking on data engineering there. This will be the home page for our data engineering experience. So in the first half, we mentioned a lot about the Lakehouse and some of the tools you can use to interact with it, like the notebook and Spark definition jobs, Spark job definitions even. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new Lakehouse. And we're going to just give it a name and click create. And within a few seconds, we are going to get a brand new lovely Lakehouse. Here you go, easy as that. So let's start off with a bit of a tour. So you can see along the top here, we have some settings in the toolbar. And I'm just going to click on settings actually and just show you some of the settings that we have. Obviously, you can change the name and the description and the endorsement. So we haven't really touched much about endorsement, but it's kind of a data governance feature that exists in Fabric, and it helps us to promote certain content and certify certain content within our organization. So if this is a Lakehouse that you want everyone to be using, or you trust the data and you validated the data, then you can endorse it. The other point is SQL Endpoint, and I haven't actually mentioned this yet in this tutorial. But the SQL Endpoint is, as the name suggests, a way of interacting with your Lakehouse using SQL. So this is automatically generated. You might have seen a little pop-up when you create a Lakehouse. Within a few minutes afterwards, Microsoft automatically creates a SQL endpoint. So this is listing the connection string. So you can connect to this data using Azure Data Studio or SQL Server Management Studio, all that good stuff. Or Power BI, obviously. And one thing to bear in mind with the SQL endpoint, we can actually click in the top right-hand corner. You can switch between the Lakehouse view and the SQL endpoint view. Now, currently we don't have any files or tables in our data set in our Lakehouse, so we can't actually query the data. Another thing to bear in mind about the SQL endpoint is that it's read-only, so we can't create data using the SQL endpoint in the Lakehouse. If we want to be doing insert and update statements, that has to be done within the data warehouse experience or within the Lakehouse using code and notebooks. So along the top here, we have get data, and there's a few different ways, and we've mentioned all of these already: data pipeline, data flow gen 2s, shortcuts. So if you've got data in Azure Data Lake already, we can create a shortcut to it. We can also create shortcuts to other places within our OneLake environment, within Fabric. And that can be either a Lakehouse or a warehouse table. So I have this other Lakehouse called Environmental Lakehouse. I'm just going to click on it and click Next. And we've got some water quality data. So let me just create a shortcut to this table. Okay, so now you can see we've added a shortcut to this table, and you can see there's a little hyperlink sign in the top left-hand corner of the icon. That means that it's a shortcut. So there you go. And we can interact with this in various different ways. Either we can open this within a notebook, so we can create a notebook on this table. And let's just briefly do that, just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so you can see that it's using Spark SQL here. And we can run this cell here just to get a display of the top, 1,000 rows in this data set, just to give you an idea of the shape of the data. And then if we wanted to do more stuff on top of that, build a pipeline of transformations, then that's where you'll do that in this notebook. And notice the pretty quick startup time with Spark in Microsoft Fabric. Although you might not think that's quick, 20 seconds actually really quick to start up a Spark cluster. And it's because they have some in reserve kind of waiting for you to send your code, basically. So here's our data. Another way of querying this data would be let's stop this session and we can close this notebook. Let's go back to our Lakehouse. And now I can show you what the SQL endpoint looks like, because we do actually have some data. So now we're going to be loading the SQL endpoint, and it looks like a warehouse, right? If you've used the data warehouse and you've seen my previous videos in the data warehouse, it looks exactly like this, right? And we can do new SQL queries of the data. We can do all sorts of things within here. So by default, we have either the structured SQL way of looking at our data, or we have the notebook where you can write PySpark or Scala. So the Lakehouse really is a lot more flexible, I would say. It's kind of more multi-purpose. You can do pretty much anything in there, apart from write commands in SQL. So let's just get rid of that and go back to our Lakehouse. So another thing we can do in our Lakehouse is to query it directly from Power BI using something that's called DirectLake mode, because we're querying direct into the lake. Very clever name. So if you click on new Power BI dataset, and we can kind of select, if we had more than one table in there, we can just choose which of these we want in our Power BI dataset. But I'm going to be using this one because that's all we got. And so when we create a data set, that's going to create a Power BI data set that we can use in our Power BI report. And then from this, we can create a new report. I'm not going to do that in this video, but that's how you would do it. So back to our Lakehouse, and another area we haven't mentioned yet is files, or at least we haven't seen yet. And here we've got lots of different options. Again, we can pipe files into here, or we can upload them in the user interface. Or we can use a tool like Azure Storage Explorer to more conveniently and more rapidly upload large files. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to add some stuff in here. Here you go. Schedule YouTube. Now, that's a very small file. There's not much of a schedule going on here. Kind of make it up as I go along, as you might have noticed. But let's upload that into our Lakehouse. And then it's probably a bad example because you'd have to use a library, I think, for XLSX files. In fact, you could probably use Pandas. So in a notebook, you can either use PySpark or you can use Pandas data frames. It allows you to do both. Pandas gives you a bit more flexibility, and it's probably more comfortable if you're coming from a data science or data engineering background. Pandas is pretty widely used as a library. But yeah, that's how you would get a file in there. And then you would create a notebook on top of this to, I don't know, extract my, I think like 4-line YouTube schedule spreadsheet. So that's a very brief overview of the Lakehouse. We started off with a few concepts and then got our hands dirty in the tool just to understand what it looks like. This is just a high level overview. We're going to be going into a lot more detail in future videos, going into the notebooks, exploring lots of data engineering, data science problems, and hopefully helping you learn Microsoft Fabric as best as possible. So if you're not already, make sure you subscribed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.